I had this old sweater, and she would wear it whenever she could. Her mother hates that thing. It smelled of mothballs, and I honestly don't even remember where it came from. But when I think of her now, she is always wearing it. Today on the Comic Book Report, Mazebook by Jeff Lemire from Dark Horse Comics. Stick around and check it out. Greetings everyone, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I'm excited to dive back into the world of Dark Horse with a release I have wanted to read for some time. Of course we're talking about Jeff Lemire's Mazebook. I have had this long recommended to me, especially after enjoying one of his other works, Underwater Welder. I had friends comment that that is to fatherhood and new life as this book is to grief, and I was fascinated and eager to figure out exactly what that looked like. And now that I've read this book here, I can't wait to talk about it. Before we jump in though, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to those at Dark Horse for sending over this review copy in exchange for this honest review. Okay, let's go ahead and jump in. First, some quick facts about today's collection. The issues in this collection were written and drawn by Jeff Lemire. The issues in this volume were published by Dark Horse beginning in 2021. The volume itself contains Mazebook issues 1 through 5. And finally, this is roughly a standard size hardcover with glossy print paper stock, a glued binding, and a total of 256 pages. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and issue a general spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the contents of today's collection and commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. Okay, and here's our first look at the standard hardcover for Mazebook from Jeff Lemire, and I really love the cover to this collection. I do believe it takes the cover from issue 1 of this series, if I'm not mistaken, but we have our central character, his beloved lost daughter, and of course the ornate maze patterns. I think that that is a really fun way to do this book, and I think the cover was chosen adequately. I'm captivated, I'm intrigued, absolutely effective. As we transition to the spine design, I have to say I'm a big fan of how understated this is. We have kind of a field of that same sort of off-white color. We have the Dark Horse logo on top, the creator, Jeff Lemire. We have that single fine red thread from the jacket. And then we have, of course, the title, Mazebook, and then another Dark Horse logo on the bottom. Really cool stuff. It's crisp, it's clean, it's effective. I like it. I want to note as well that this collection does not include a dust jacket. It's just the hardcover itself. As far as the back cover goes, we have a brief description of the book, that kind of ball of red thread from the unraveling sweater, some accolades, pricing information, publication stuff, everything pretty standard here. I like the look of it though, pretty crisp. I would have loved to see another character model or a bit more art, but I think having that ball of thread or yarn was still pretty evocative, and yeah, overall I do think it worked for me. Okay, now a quick look at this edition's binding. I do believe it's glued binding. It's a tad hard to tell. I will say the binding worked pretty well. My first read through, it laid down pretty flat. Looking at it again recently, I do notice that some of my pages are coming up against that little back ribbon. It perhaps is just my copy, but other than that, I was happy with this binding. Like I said, it laid down really flat. I didn't have any issues with gutter loss whatsoever, so of course that's always nice. And here's my book next to a copy of Underwater Welder, which I also reviewed on my channel not too long ago. Underwater Welder was kind of my introduction to Lemire's more human, kind of surreal look at humanity. Anyway, I really loved Underwater Welder, and a lot of people said if I liked that, I would also love Mazebook, and they were correct. But I thought I'd showcase this book as well. In case you've enjoyed Mazebook and are looking for a recommendation, I could do the opposite and also refer you back to Underwater Welder. Okay, and just a quick size comparison for all of you. I know earlier I said roughly standard size. I do believe that outside of the hardback, the actual pages are probably really close, if not exactly on a standard size, or roughly the height of a floppy. But to showcase just a size comparison, I do have a standard size trade paperback, in this case, Dear Editor from Mad Cave Studios, another recent read and review I've done, and also my Extinction Agenda Omnibus from Marvel Comics. That's a kind of standard oversized format. So anyway, you can see where Mazebook here stacks up next to them. Like I said, I think that this is pretty much just a standard size release, but again, wanted to give you all a good look. Okay, now that I've provided you with that size comparison, we can go ahead and jump into the collection proper. And after some rich red end pages, we have a title page, publication information page, creator page, and then we basically jump right into issue 1 of Mazebook. So as I mentioned, this is a 5-issue series, and it is completely self-contained. So we have a complete kind of graphic novel reading experience, all within this one singular volume. And no, you don't need to read anything prior to enjoy this release, which I also really like. So what is Mazebook? I've kind of hinted or alluded at some of the main kind of themes of this book already, but this is really Lemire's examination of grief and the loss of a child. Yes, it has a pretty heavy theme, as you can probably tell, but I think it's really expertly done, and honestly, this is in many ways Lemire's most human story I've had the privilege of reading. We basically follow our central protagonist years after he's lost his daughter Wendy. Throughout the issues, we find out that his marriage kind of fell apart and he became more or less a shell of his former self. His wife has gone on and married someone else, has a new kid, and he is kind of a loner. He is sort of a civil engineer or architect of some kind. He works for the city. He's always working with blueprints and mazes, but he really just goes through his days and routines completely listlessly. He really has had his whole life uprooted by the loss of his child, and that's where this story really takes place. We have him musing and reflecting on his lost daughter Wendy. He still recalls a lot of things about her, but he cannot seem to remember what her face looks like. And he doesn't really register a lot of new faces either. He's almost unconcerned with that. He's troubled by the fact that he's forgetting aspects of his daughter. In many ways, that his worst nightmare come to life. But he does fixate on this detail that his daughter had this ratty red sweater that basically was kind of fraying on edges. And so throughout a lot of this book, we see the kind of red thread moving throughout things. And it's sort of his mental way of linking a roadmap that leads to her. I really liked that motif. I thought it was all used really, really well and evocatively. This book isn't oversaturated with color, so when we do get splashes of color or that red yarn or thread from the sweater, it really does pop in a substantial way. Of course, Lemire not only wrote this book but illustrated it as well. I've really fallen in love with his kind of scratchy, sketchy style. I cannot believe the range of human emotions he's able to depict. I initially didn't love his style, but slowly over time, reading more and more Lemire books, I have just completely fallen in love with it, and this is some of the sharpest of his work I've seen visually. It really is something to behold. But anyway, going back to the kind of the shape of this story, essentially this man, after losing his daughter for years and years, he kind of is sort of having waking dreams about her, and then he misses a call on his phone at like 3 a.m, and the next night when it happens again, he picks up the phone and hears his daughter's voice asking to kind of come find her, and he basically goes on this mission after hearing this call, believing his daughter is either still alive or trying to contact him somehow, and he basically tries to follow the thread here visually shown by that red sweater thread, but basically he tries to follow where he thinks his daughter might be. He ends up showing up at his ex-wife's doorstep and is able to go into her attic and kind of rifle through his daughter's belongings, and basically he kind of comes to realize that she is in a kind of maze. We get some flashbacks and kind of understand that she was obsessed with books of mazes or maze books, as particularly the ones where you have the line mazes that go through all the different angles. He realizes that the maze that she ended on before she passed away must be the maze that he has to use to find her. He ends up getting this exact maze tattooed on his skin at one point in his fixation here. He's not really sure where to go or what the next clue is until he realizes that it must be a map of the very city and the starting point, which I think was her hospital or something, and then from there he's able to walk through his very own city to try to find her. He knows that he might be losing grasp with reality. In fact, his ex-wife is kind of disparaging about it and kind of is alarmed at where he's going, but he just can't stop. He's kind of pushing his job to the side, and he is just absolutely solely focused on seeing where this maze leads him. Along the way, he begins to befriend one of his neighbors, who is a woman who seems to be interested in this man, at first maybe pitying him or wanting to have sympathy for him. In fact, at one point she invites him in for some nice food, and he he basically explains his whole drive right now, and instead of kind of basically saying he's crazy, she is very sympathetic and says, okay, well, find out what this all means. It's still important to you no matter what this is. I think you should really find it out. And basically, he goes on this quest around the city, and he finds like brick walls in his way, and ultimately he kind of goes into the sewers and tries to find hidden passageways. And when he comes out of the sewer at one point, he's in this, I'm going to guess, kind of a hyper-real or dream state where there's a talking dog who's actually his neighbor's lost dog, who's kind of his guide through this next part of the maze. There's also a physical embodiment of this kind of minotaur, so thinking like old school maze mythology kind of stuff, and he kind of is an embodiment of a lot of the stuff he's trying to avoid, or kind of the antagonistic evil force. But yeah, he's basically following this dog, trying to go through his own mind and memory, just ultimately trying to find his daughter. Here, Lemire actually uses a kind of labyrinth or maze setup where each page kind of traces a different part of the maze. It has to be visually seen, of course, as I'm flipping through for you to understand what I'm trying to say, but Lemire really hits it out of the park here. This is such a visual treat, and I'm really impressed at what he's done with how he's done the formatting and layouts and all the artistic direction here. The story of Mazebook really does culminate when he reaches the end of the maze and finds his daughter. He sees his daughter's face perfectly, and basically he says, I got your message. And his daughter Wendy basically says, no, you didn't, or you wouldn't be here. And there's this really loving dialogue of basically Wendy just saying, I'm just your memory. And he says that all he's ever wanted to be is her father, and she basically says, you were the best daddy ever, but unless you let me go, you can't be anything else. And it's just this really sad moment where he has to like let go as part of the grieving process that, you know, obviously he'll always remember her and love her, but he has to let go enough so that he can hold on to new opportunities and new stages of life, because he's so haunted by what he's lost. And we have him letting go and her kind of becoming the ball of yarn from the sweater, and then ultimately he kind of wakes up and he's found the maze, and at the end he basically returns the neighbor's dog and is invited in, and there's kind of hints that this might be a new romantic pursuit, and it's ultimately about moving forward in the stages of life and how you navigate grief. And that's really where the story resolves, but I really cannot underscore just how impressive this was across the 5 issues. Like I said earlier in this video, I consider this one of Lemire's most human stories, and that is really saying something. I have not read the fullness of his bibliography just yet, and I have really enjoyed so much of what he's written thus far, but I'm finding myself really drawn to this cross-section that Lemire sometimes toys with. I see it most predominantly from what I've read in this as well as in Underwater Welder, where we have a very human set of characters and emotions explored, characters that feel really authentic and just really grounded rather than these kind of fantastical larger than life kind of figures. And we have this kind of realistic person in a realistic setting, but then we kind of blur or skew the lines into kind of a surrealistic or magic realism kind of space, and that is just really a sweet spot for Lemire and also for me as a reader. I was absolutely fascinated by what I read with Underwater Welder, to the point where it felt like a really great episode of The Twilight Zone, and I feel shades of that here with Mazebook as well, where we dip into the fantastical, surreal, or magical, realistic kind of spaces, but you still feel so grounded, rock solid with these characters, and ultimately the exploration of a real true set of emotions, or in this case, the whole idea of grief. I really am impressed with Lemire. I've always been a fan of his writing, but I'm finding these kind of slice of life or slice and life of death kind of stories really some of his most captivating for me. I've seen him do superhero, I've seen him do horror, I've seen him do so many different genres, but these human stories that blur into the surrealistic are just some of my favorite. I already shared my bit about his art earlier. I think that this is some of his most impressive work I've seen that's actually drawn from him, between the kind of range of emotions we get on the character models, as well as just the really imaginative and out-of-the-box thinking with the page layouts and the actual physical maze kind of diagram or flowing kind of motion. I just think it's really impressive, the layout work, especially as we get to kind of the third act of this one. I really just see him going all out. After we reach the end of those 5 issues of Mazebook, I am happy to say at the back of this hardcover we do have a collection of extras in the form of a variant cover art gallery, along with a really cool section of behind the scenes kind of commentary. We have Lemire talking and discussing this work, behind the scenes sketches, illustrations, kind of rejected cover designs, things like that. This is really fun if you like to see how the sausage is made, as it were, to have a work that was written and drawn by the same creative, and then having them kind of comment or really explore some of the making of. It was just a real treat. I skimmed this material here and there, but I really enjoyed it. I thought this was a great way to cap the collection, and as someone who is often asking for things like essays at the back of a given comic collected edition, this was a real treat for me. Okay, and that has been Mazebook by Jeff Lemire, and I think that all that's left to do now is to give this book a grade. Well, Lemire has knocked it out of the park once again. This was every bit as good as was promised to me, and then some. For this haunting yet beautiful exploration of grief, coupled with Lemire's sharpest pencil work I've seen to date, the Comic Book Report is happy to give Mazebook from Dark Horse an A-. I would consider this a must-read Lemire work, and maybe a must-read graphic novel or comic read, period. I loved this story. It was a tearjerker, and honestly, I cannot recommend it enough. This and Underwater Welder were just really fascinating works, and I'm so happy I have now read both of them. Absolutely exceptional. But that's just my thought on Mazebook by Jeff Lemire. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you read Mazebook? What are some other Jeff Lemire titles you could safely recommend? I'd love to get some discussions going in the comments section, and thank you everyone for sticking around through this video, and a special thank you again to those at Dark Horse for sending over this review copy in exchange for this honest review. Until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to leave your like, that comment we talked about, and maybe share this video with a friend. Thanks everyone. Have a good one.